Marcus Warner, welcome back to Apollos Watered.
Hey, it's good to be here, Travis. I had a good time last time. I think I shared way too much personal stuff, but you do that to people, I think. So
I don't know if that's a gift or a curse or what,
know.
but I do find that maybe we should start calling it, I don't know, podcast confessions, something like that, where people start just admitting all the different things in their life.
I know. My son was proud of me for admitting that I watched anime, so we did that.
It was a bonding moment for the two of you.
It was a bonding moment. It was good. Yeah.
You know, when I went back to edit that show, and I started to laugh again that you admitted it.
I know. Yeah.
But are you ready? You've done this before, but we're gonna do it again. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Let's do it. Five.
Okay. Here we go. Number one. What was your favorite toy when you were a kid?
It was my Stingray bike. I rode it everywhere, went to the park with it, rode in trails, pretended I was Daniel Boone. I mean, it was,
Daniel Boone on a dirt bike.
I'm just saying, it was my horse, so it's like, I could always pretend I was anything. I'm old, so that wasn't that long before.
I miss those days though, and everybody just rode their bike and your mom would say, be back before sundown.
Exactly. That was my life.
Days.
That was my childhood. Yep.
Oh, good times. Good times. All right. Second question. What is the household chore that you enjoy the least?
Oh my. Well, household chore I enjoy the least, honestly, is just figuring out how to organize everything. It's like I get so overwhelmed just by the sheer volume of what needs to find a place that I give up and punt too often. But yeah, that's the one I hate the least, is just trying to figure out how to organize all the clutter.
There's so much clutter. First world problems.
It's a first world problem for sure.
It is a first world problem for sure. I mean, there is something strange in our culture when we have people making money because they have storage facilities because we have too much stuff to put in our house.
Exactly.
No. A little simplicity, I think. A little simplicity. But I said that to my wife, and then she says, no. I mean, she's like, yes, I agree with you. Simplicity. And then I try to throw away her cassette tapes that were remixed that we don't even have a cassette player for.
Right.
And she's like, no, you can't throw those out. I'm like, what are you talking about? We don't, or even VHS stuff. We don't even have this anymore. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I know. We always have plans for it. We're gonna
we're gonna do it, but it never happens. All right, number 3. How about this one? What's the household chore you enjoy the most?
The most is probably this is gonna be weird, but just doing the dishes. I think because I grew up doing it as a kid, and so there's something kind of relaxing about that. Second would be just mowing the lawn. Yeah.
I have a friend of mine who owns a bunch of McDonald's. And this was from years ago when we were in Chicago together, and he had a different place, like a different home out in the country. And I learned this, and being in the city, you don't have any grass really anywhere. I mean, just a little patch of yard. And I grew up as a farm kid. We had to mow all the time. And I remember asking him, I was like, hey, can I go out to your house and just mow your yard? And he's like, no. And I was surprised because I thought, oh, what a great thing would be this thing for me to volunteer to do, because who likes to mow their yard if you have to mow it all the time? And he goes, no, that's the only time where no one bugs me.
Oh,
That's my time. Time.
Yep.
But I'm with you on that. I like doing the dishes because no one talks to me. Yeah.
I like it because it's short. I get it done, and I feel like I've accomplished something.
Oh, that's a good feeling. Okay, number 4. If you were an app, a phone app, what app would you be and why?
If I was an app, well,
if you were an app,
this is really boring. But my first thought was Notability. I use Notability all of the time as I keep all of my meeting notes there. It's like, but you can also do art. And you can draw, and you can create, and you can import, and you can create all kinds of things. So it's functional. It gets a lot of stuff done, but it's also creative.
I didn't even know that app existed.
I'm just saying, it's the first one popped in my head. My son, again, that's when my son said, hey, Dad, you got to get this. And I now use it for all of my meetings. So
now I'm going to check that out after we're done.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Number 5. If you were a car, what kind of car would you be and why?
If I was a car, I would, that's an impossible question. I would be, I would probably be a Jeep, because Well, where I live in suburbia, and Jeeps are a status symbol here. They're not used for off-roading. Like if you're a rich high school kid, you've got a Jeep, right? Because that's kind of how that works around here. So I'm not sure what that says about me, but that's where I connect. Okay.
You don't want to, I mean, you've got some photographs behind you, Colorado, Yellowstone.
Yeah. I have a
That's what you
desire to
long
be out.
for.
I have a desire to be that sort of thing, but my Colorado experience is more like hiking and Garden of the Gods, where they got bathrooms every 200 feet, that sort of thing. But I have.
That's the most thing that makes me stressful. When I'm driving someplace and I don't know where I'm going to park and I don't know where the bathroom is.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just betrays my age. All right, well let's jump in. Actually, we got a few things we're going to talk about today. I've got two books here. I've got Rare Leadership in the Workplace and Rare Leadership. And we also got a little bit of Deeper Walk, which we've talked about in the past. But today we're going to focus a little bit on Rare Leadership. Now, what is Rare Leadership? And you co-authored this with Jim Wilder. So you have to forgive me if I say that you wrote this and it was Jim. I don't know who wrote what.
Yeah.
But what is Rare Leadership and why is it important?
So Rare Leadership is really about maturity. All right. It asks the question, what separates the leaders we love to follow from the leaders we have to follow? And it's a one-word answer. That is, are they mature? And so Dr. Wilder, who co-wrote it with me, is a neuroscience attachment theory expert. And he developed a system called the Life Model that is a maturity development system. And so what we did is we took his approach and we oriented it towards leadership and said, what have we learned from neuroscience and attachment theory about maturity development, and how does that impact the way people lead? Because if you go through the church, you go through nonprofits, you go into government, you go into hospitals, doesn't matter where you go, things are blowing up because of a lack of maturity in our leaders. And so what we've done is we use, so Jim is, he thinks in terms of brain, what's happening in the brain, what synapses are firing, what's happening here. I think in terms of acronyms and acrostics. So I took his ideas and put them into the acrostic RARE, which stands for, these are the 4 characteristics of mature leadership. And the first one is they remain relational. And because if I don't remain relational, I am shutting down, I'm blowing up, I'm melting down. But whatever happens, you lose me. My relational self doesn't show up. So the second characteristic is the A is act like yourself. And again, the idea here is some of us change our personality with every emotion that we feel. And so I am a totally different person when I'm angry, or I'm a totally different person when I'm sad, or I'm a totally different person when I'm afraid. And so what happens is if I'm the leader and my whole persona changes with every emotion that I feel, then people walk on eggshells around me because they never know which leader they're going to get. So there has to be some, it's not that I'm not affected by emotions, but they don't turn me into a different person. And so what you find with a lot of people who lack that level of maturity, there'll often be somebody in the office who functions almost like a surrogate mom, and they warn everybody what mood the boss is in today, kind of, watch where you step today because, you're not going to he's not in a good mood. And we've learned to kind of justify these things, excuse these things. But the idea is that these are really what make or break the culture that we're trying to build is the personal maturity. So then the third one is return to joy. And that's the idea that joy is actually the fuel your brain wants to run on. It will run on fear when it has to, but it wants to run on joy. And so as a leader, I'm either going to motivate people with joy or with fear. And I'm either going to motivate myself with joy or with fear. Now, we all do a little bit of both, but if I am routinely motivating myself with fear, I'm going to burn myself out. And if I'm routinely motivating my people with fear, I'm going to burn them out. So I need to, as a leader, be able to return to joy myself, and I need to be able to help my team recognize where they're at with their emotions, help them return to joy, and help all of us kind of do what we're doing because we love what we're doing and not because of the bad stuff that's going to happen if we don't. And then that leads to the E, and that is that we endure hardship well. And that is immature people try to avoid hardship at all costs. Mature people endure hardship well. And the well is basically defined by the first 3 characteristics. And that is when things get tough, I still remain relational. I still act like myself, and I return to joy, and I help people around me return to joy so that the best version of ourselves is showing up. So that's rare leadership in a nutshell.
Dude, that is so much that I'm listening to you share that. And I'm like, any one of these, I'm picturing myself in every one of these. And I'm like, I'm in trouble. Like my team is listening to this right now going, he needs to listen to this episode. It will be really good for him.
Yeah.
I think there is truth to that for each one of us, but I want to break this down. And you talk about this aspect. You said art. I'm opening it up. It's been a little bit since I've read this, because I read this and then I read your other book. I read this one before that. But you're talking about rare leadership. So is it what again?
Remain relational is the first one.
Remain relational. So these are talking about I know Jim refers to our relational circuits, right? Our RCs are on or off.
Yep.
The one thing, and I've kind of talked to Jim and Michael Hendricks about this, is that the one thing I struggle with, it's talking about brain science. I mean, it's brain science, and there's a whole nother language that's needed to get this. Describe what these relational circuits are, or maybe this is a question for Jim, but what are these relational circuits? Like, how do we remain relational? What's the other alternative if we don't?
So the way I describe it is there's basically an on-off switch on the right side of your brain. And when that switch is on, my relational self is present. When I am relational, I use the acrostic CAKE to evaluate this. So there's really clear. And that is when I'm relational, I'm curious. I'm curious how you feel. I'm curious what you think. Right. When I'm not relational, I'm not curious. I think I have you all figured out. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I lose all curiosity about you. So that's an on-off switch. So when my relational circuits are basically when this whole side of my brain is functioning properly and hasn't shut down. So you think about this on-off switch, it's a little bit like when it goes off, it's like my brain is going into a cramp. And when my brain goes into a cramp, and things start shutting down on this side and the switch goes off, I lose access to the higher level brain functions. And it's at the higher level brain functions that I remain relational and act like myself and live with joy. So as this cramps up and I lose access to those higher level functions, I become less relational. I stop acting like myself and I lose my joy. And some of us just live there and some of us get stuck there for long periods of time. And it's why we go to counseling. Like we don't go to counseling because we have too much joy, right? We go to counseling because we can't find our joy. And so this is part of it. So, the technical term that most people know is amygdala, right? The amygdala is like the fight or flight part. So what happens with the amygdala is really what is causing this thing to, cramp up and shut down or stay on. And so the amygdala is assessing every attachment that I form. And that assessment was one of three things. It's either good, it's bad, or it's scary. So if it's good, right, that's easy for me to stay relational, act like myself. This is all fun. This is all good. That's no problem. If it's bad, it tends to trigger what we call low energy emotions, which low energy emotions would be like shame, or this is bad. I'm bad. I'm doing bad things. Or disgust, like I'm disgusted with myself, I'm disgusted with you. That's a low energy emotion. Sadness and despair. Those are like the four classic low energy emotions. If the amygdala says this is scary, then that's when I get fight or flight. And I will become angry. I want this to stop, or I become scared. I just got to get out of here. And so when I'm running on a lot of fear, then I have high energy going on in my body. So where this gets really complicated, if it's not already, where this starts to get is that you can have high energy and low energy emotions at the same time. So to your body, it's a little bit like somebody stepping on the gas and stepping on the brakes at the same time. It's like I've got fear and anger that are stepping on the gas, and I've also got shame and despair that are stepping on the brakes. And so my body can literally shake, right? Because I've got so much stress and so much pressure under here. And so as the way this affects every relationship we have, it affects all of life. And so maturity is maturity. We're just going to take maturity and apply it to leadership. But so you got to understand maturity first so that you can understand how this directly impacts leadership and how to apply. So I said CAKE, I just gave you the one. It's curiosity, it's appreciation, it's kindness, and it's eye contact. So basically the idea here is that when my switch is on, my relational circuits are running, it's easy for me to do those four things. I can be curious about you. I can appreciate what you bring to the table, appreciate what you do. I can be kind much more easily, and it's easy to make eye contact. When my switch goes off, one of the first things I often lose is eye contact. I just find myself looking at anybody but you. So you probably heard your wife say, "Would you please look at me?" Right? It's the right. It's that eye contact thing has been lost. And when that gets triggered and that switch goes down, a normally kind person can't think of a way to be kind right now. It's like, I can't even think of what it looks like to be kind to you right now. I just am so upset with you, or whatever it is. So I've lost that ability. So so what we tell people then is that you get these circuits back on by, first of all, recognizing that they've gone off, kind of break eye contact with the person. And now you're in problem solving mode in your brain. And the problem you're trying to solve is, how do I find some curiosity, appreciation, and kindness? And then once I can find those and my relational circuits start flowing again, and that switch pops back on, now I can make eye contact again, re-engage. And sometimes that takes seconds, and sometimes it takes minutes, and sometimes it takes days. Right. So now and then it depends on how developed your capacity to do it is. And that's really one of the hallmarks of maturity, is that mature people do this quickly, and immature people often get stuck here, and it changes everything.
I feel like I need to schedule you for a counseling session. There's so much that you've already said that made me stop and go, oh no, am I not the mature person? Like, even you mentioned the cake. I'm like, there are times where I'm like, I'm not curious about right now what you have to say. I don't want to know. But I mean, how do we remain relational in that way? I know you alluded to it already, but when we go into that, and I think Jim calls it enemy mode, when the relationship circuit shut off, how do we then remain relational with people and stay curious?
Yeah, so if you have lost it, then by definition, you've lost it, right? You're not there. So the question is, how do you get it back? Well, that's what we mean by the second R, the return to joy. How do I get back from here? And so sometimes I just need a break, right? Sometimes it's like, I'll find my curiosity in 5 minutes. I just need a break. Sometimes that break is I avoid eye contact, and like Jim has described doing this in counseling sessions, right? It's like, you hear somebody describing a problem that you've heard 1,000 other people describe. You kind of know where this is going, and you can lose your curiosity. And so when that would happen, he'd look away. He said, he would think to himself, what can I be curious about? And then when he'd find something, he'd remake eye contact, and his relational self would be present again. So the goal here is not to not feel things, but to remain relational even when I do feel things. We put it this way: let's keep relationships bigger than problems. Because the other thing that happens when my relational circuits go off is that I get into enemy mode, and I'm doing things without my relational self present, is I end up, I'm much more likely to care only about winning, and to be more interested just in what is best for me. And I stop caring about what is best for you. And so that's what defines enemy mode. Enemy mode is where I only care about my own victory here and what's going to be best for me. And I no longer care about you. So now then we need a break. All right. So a pause, and that could be like I said, just a 30-second pause while I kind of find it in this conversation. Or it could be, I really need a timeout. Can we come back to this conversation tomorrow? Or, I really need to. So there have been times, for instance, in marriage, where my wife and I, it's getting toward the end of the day, we're like, we're either going to stay up all night, arguing about this, or we just need to agree to keep the relationship bigger than the problem, put this thing on hold, take a break, do something that will be happy together, that'll help us be happy together. And then let's bring this up tomorrow and deal with it another time. So that's like, we call that, let's just keep the relationship bigger than the problem. So you got to recognize when you have lost it and you are not doing those things. So we do use cake as the evaluation tool. Am I curious? Am I appreciative? Am I kind? Can I make eye contact? And if I've lost those things, it means I'm offline. I get them back online by taking a break and finding them. And if I can do it in one conversation, great. If I can't, then I may need to excuse myself, take it, and go find some.
As you're mentioning that the relationship is bigger than the problem. I like that description. We've always had in our marriage where we would say that we don't go to bed angry. And no matter what, we wouldn't go to bed angry. And I remember sharing that in a sermon, and this older man walks up to me, saunters up to me afterwards, and he just looks at me and he goes, 3 days. And I was looking at him quizzically. I didn't understand what he was talking about. And he turned to walk away. And I said, 3 days, 3 days, what? He goes, that's how long we've been awake. meaning that we haven't gone to bed yet because we're still fighting. I mean, he was a jokester, but some people still have they don't have a clear definition of joy. And you mentioned the difference between the brain operating on joy or fear. Let's define joy. How do you define joy?
So from a brain perspective, joy is based in attachment. It is a happy to see you attachment. And so it's the feeling that we get, right? And so it's not a choice the way that we tend to be taught. There are choices we can make that make it more likely, but it's, if you're a grandparent and your grandkids walk in the room, you don't go, oh, they're here, I better choose to be happy, right? It's this reaction that you have, oh, it's you, and I'm genuinely happy to see you. Sometimes we can have that with somebody we just met. Oh, it's like, oh, I remember you. Yeah, we had a good positive encounter, and I'm feeling a little bit of joy right now. So that's joy, is that feeling that comes in my brain when I'm happy to be with somebody. This is why I can even be grieving a loss of something, but be happy to be with my wife when she sits down next to me and we're there together. There can still be some joy, even in the grief. And it's actually that joy that gives me the strength to deal with the hardships of life. So we would say that the key to enduring hardship well is really cultivating the ability to have joyful relationships in our lives and maximize the joy potential in our relationships. So in another book I wrote, I called it the joy gap. That is, there's this gap between moments of shared joy, and the bigger that gap gets, the easier it is for negative emotions to take over.
What is the difference between how brain science defines joy and we would biblically define joy?
So there is, that's a good question, because what happens when we go to defining terms, we tend to read our own definitions into them.
Of course, yeah.
And so what happens is, if I have come to believe that joy is a choice, then when I see the biblical word joy, I go, oh, well, see, there it is. And then it's the same thing with love. Is love a choice or is love attachment?
Both.
Right. It's like there's times when I choose to do the loving thing, but I can't just choose an attachment. So an attachment has to be developed. It has to be grown. It has to be discovered. It has to be nurtured. So at the heart of who God is, this word chesed is an attachment word. It's the idea that God is so bonded to us that he wants what is good for us, right? And so I do what's good for some people simply because of the attachment I have with them. There's some people, because of our bond, I'll do things for them I wouldn't do for other people. Right. That's kind of what chesed is. It's like, because of our attachment, I'm going to do something for you I wouldn't, just necessarily do for anybody, but I'm doing it because I love you. So that's a little bit different than I'm going to choose to love you right now. Right. No, it's like, I already love you. but I'm going to now make some choices because I love you. And so joy is an attachment word. And I would say, biblically speaking, it's also an attachment word. So what's really fascinating is how connected it is to grace. Because, grace, and forgive me, it's been 1 minute since I looked at it, but like charis, charin, right? So in charis, and charin are related words. One's joy, one's grace. And the idea is that grace is an attachment word. And it's the idea that God freely attaches to us, because of what Jesus did. And because of that, there can be joy in my walk with God, because I know that God is happy to see me. And I say this is crucial, because I think that one of the biggest barriers in our walk with God is that we're fear bonded to God instead of joy bonded to him. We don't see God as being happy to be with us until we perform. And so we look at God as he's got to choose to love me today. He doesn't really love me. Right. And so we read a lot of our own stuff into that. So that's a long answer, but joy from a biblical perspective, I would say, is actually the same. It's still an attachment-based word that is related to relational happiness. So where do you find joy most often in the Bible? It's in the face of God.
Mm.
right? So it tends to get translated in English as the presence of God, but the Hebrew word there is face. And I don't think that's an accident. It's like make the face of God shine upon you. Well, I don't think it's the Moses shining face that we're talking about there. I think it's a joyful face. Like like your face lights up when you're with somebody you're happy to see. And I think this is God's, may God's face light up with joy when he sees you. Right. That's a great blessing. And I think that's what that's talking about. And in Psalm 16, David says, I find joy in your face, right? Eternal pleasures in your right hand. And so I think that that's part of it too. Why do I find joy in God's face? It's because humanly speaking, I get it from people's eyes. Their eyes light up. And it's the first place that babies look, when they see you, they're looking at your eyes. And what they're looking for is, are you happy to see me? And if you're happy to see me, then bonding is really easy.
All of that is so incredible to think about how we are wired for joy and for the belonging aspect. And you talk about this in the book. Belonging is really one of our core needs. God's made us to want to belong and have that desire. Why have we missed this so much, though? This idea of belonging in the church and in leadership?
Well, I think the main reason that we've missed it is that there was an Enlightenment influence that came into us. Like we fought against the Enlightenment, but it influenced us in subtle ways we didn't recognize. And one of them was that out of the Enlightenment came the idea that reason is the core thing about being human. But the second generation of the Enlightenment moved past reason and said it's actually the will is the most fundamental thing about being human. And so that philosophical movement is called voluntarism. And what voluntarism taught us was that everything boils down to choice. And so we sort of read that back into the Bible and we turned everything into a choice, right? We turned salvation into a choice, make a decision for Christ, right? We turn, as opposed to attach to Christ, be grafted into the vine, let that attachment grow. It became transactional. So choices turn everything transactional. It's very difficult to have a lot of joyful bonding attached, relationship when my whole relationship is just, I'll do this for you if you do that for me. And, you give me money, I'll do that, or whatever it is. It's all tit for tat. That's transactional. The, what we're talking about here is, bigger than that. So anyway, back to voluntarism though, it's this idea of the will. And so what is out of voluntarism that we began saying love is a choice, right? Joy is a choice, salvation, everything became a choice. And so now we read the Bible and we just see choice in it. When if we actually read closely, there's nothing about choice in that text. We've just sort of read it into there. And it's not that choices aren't important. Don't get me wrong. It's not like it's attachment or choice, but the brain, I think, helps us understand this, and that attachment comes first in the brain and then choices. And I think that's the way God designed it. And that is that he wants us, because of our attachments, to make loving choices. But we don't have to just choose to create a loving attachment to my wife every day. I have that when I wake up. I have to sometimes remind myself that it exists and make choices consistent with it. But I'm not just choosing to start loving her that's not what's going on.
When you talk about the believing in the attachment aspect of things, and that influences our choices, do you think that that's one of the things that's been missing a lot in the church, because we focus so much on the choice aspect as an individual and not as belonging and attaching to a group of people?
Yeah, no question, because that's the emphasis on choice slides very naturally into performance, right? And that is making the right choices, is performing the right way. The idea of the soil, and you look back on your life, you go, when did I grow the most as a Christian? When did I find it the easiest to grow? And it was almost always when I was in a group that was happy to be together. And me and my people, we were doing this together, right? That's when I flourish. And it's because all the nutrients of that relational joy fuel growth. Well, what happens is if you say, well, that's a nice icing on the cake if you can get there. But what we really need is a disciplined, quiet time and practicing these spiritual disciplines, making sure that you're making all the right choices and doing all these other things. What we've essentially done is if you remove joy and relational joy out of the discipleship process, it becomes draining, right? It becomes a lot of hard work and it's all on you. So it's not that those things aren't important. But if I'm doing them out of, it's like the difference is the joy the foundation or is the joy the icing on the cake, right? And I'm like, if joy is actually at the foundation of what's going on, all those other things just become much easier. Without them, I need a ton of accountability, and accountability is basically fear. It's like, if you don't do this, I will do that. So what we're trying to do here is say, well, it's not that accountability is always bad, but there's something better. And that is that if I, as a leader, if I can create a culture where people are bonded together in joy, then they don't need nearly as much accountability, because in fact, I've got to tell them to go home. Okay, that's enough. We've been doing this long enough. Everybody, take a break, because I'm doing what I love with people that I love, and we're in this together. And there's an energy that is created. It's when you're lacking joy and when you're lacking that energy that you have to build everything on accountability.
Is that possible in a church that's larger?
Yes, because it happens in spheres. So senior pastor and exec team build joy with each other. That has to be a joy-based culture that passes then. So then when the other execs are meeting with their team, that joy gets passed on. And when others then that joy gets passed on. In other words, every leader is responsible for creating a joy-based culture in the teams that they lead. Now, in that joy-based culture, I'm just saying that's first. It's the priority. Then comes, okay, here's what we need to accomplish, and this is why we need to get there. But if you flip those, then what happens is everybody's doing everything out of fear of what will happen if I don't. And I'll be honest, there's some big churches that are notorious for chewing up and spitting out staff. Mm-hmm. Right? So why are they doing this? Why are they chewing up and spitting out staff? It's because they've lost the joy component to the leadership, and they're not leading with maturity. And so in the absence of joy and maturity, the only thing left to you is fear. And it's like, get this done or else. And so there are, don't get me wrong, we got, salespeople got to bring in money, coaches got to win, people got to eat, right? You got to get this stuff out there. So there are things that have to happen. But even there, if you lose sight of why you're doing it in the first place, and you're only doing it to hit the numbers, and you're only doing it to get there, the joy gets sucked out of it. And pretty soon you don't want to do that anyway. You're just going to go do something else. So the idea here is we got to find a way to keep joy at the core of what's going on, even as we're pursuing excellence and pursuing the numbers.
You mentioned the fear as a motivator or joy, and you mentioned some larger churches. I was interviewed for a very larger, well-known church for their senior pastor position. And I was asked, the first question I was asked was, how do you survive in a toxic leadership environment? And I thought, wow, that's telling. Yeah. And my response was, make it not that way. Yeah. Because you can't survive in that way. No. I mean, not long term. But how do you transition something from toxic, and let's define that first. What is a toxic environment? And then how do we transition that into a healthy one?
So in simple terms, a toxic environment is one run on fear, right? And a healthy environment is one that's run on joy. So it's not that there's never fear. It's just that you don't camp out there. You come back, you return from the fear to joy. And so that you're constantly coming back to that, the bigger motivation of why we're doing things. Fear is often driven by shame. And so one of the reasons we have so much toxicity in leadership is that there's so much narcissism in leadership, because as Dr. Wilder defined it, narcissism is essentially the inability to return to joy from shame. And so what happens is, if I personally as a leader can't handle feeling shame, I don't want to be embarrassed. All of a sudden, without anybody saying it, that becomes the driving core value of the culture that I'm creating. Whatever happens, make sure the senior pastor looks good, right? Don't ever make him have to handle any shame. Well, if that's the culture I'm creating, I don't have to, organize that. Everybody just kind of picks up on it pretty quickly. And so what happens now is my fear of feeling shame starts to drive the way that I lead, and toxicity quickly follows. So I would say that in a lot of the toxic cultures, you're also going to find some level of narcissism, which is this inability to deal with shame, which leads to people organizing things in a way where, they look good. That's a huge topic in and of itself, obviously. But one of in some ways, the photo negative of rare leadership is narcissistic leadership.
Taking it the narcissistic leadership aspect of it, I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it. You have given us so much to really think about, and I want to stop and rewind and play again to make sure that I get all of the nuances of everything that you're talking about. When you talk about a leader, a narcissist has the inability to deal with shame.
Right.
I want to understand what that means, because there's a lot of talk about shame.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, some people say that there's, and I spoke with Jim about this, there's toxic shame, and then there's healthy shame.
Right.
And I had Taylor Lau, New Testament scholar from Trinity, on, and he wrote a book called Defending Shame, going through Paul's letters, because Paul uses shame as an aspect of motivation. How do we then see this shame, and how does a narcissistic leader fail to deal with shame? What kind of shame are we talking about here?
So it can look a lot of different ways. Jim actually wrote a book on this called The Pandora Problem that Deeper Walk publishes. So if people want to take a deeper dive into this topic, there's a whole book on it. The idea here is, let's look biblically at, and Jim does this in Pandora Problem, is Absalom, David, and Saul. Okay, all three of them had moral failings. How did they deal with them? Saul and Absalom dealt with them like narcissists, and David handled it like a human, shall we say? Not, yeah, it's too harsh, but you know what I'm saying? He dealt with that with humility is really the word I was going for there. It came out wrong. So Saul, when he is told the kingship's going to be taken away from him, what's his first reaction? He's like, Samuel, at least go out with me in front of the elders so I won't look bad to them. Right? What's his core concern? He doesn't want to look bad. So that's a narcissistic reaction. It's not, okay, I need to own this. What did David do? You know, he went into fasting. He was publicly humbling himself. He wrote a psalm about his repentance, right? He was very open about it. How about Absalom? Absalom was like, oh, if only I was in charge, everything would be better, you know. And so what's characteristic of people who can't handle shame is that they become very good at avoiding shame. And so you do that by deflecting it. And so the first strategy is to deflect the shame onto somebody else. So it might be right back at you. So if you say something about me and I'm like, well, me, you're saying that about me? Well, what about you? You know, that's a classic kind of narcissistic reaction. Or I tell people, if you're going to interview and you want to try to weed some of this out, a good question to ask is, tell me about a time when you experienced shame and how you handled it. Because a lot of times people will tell you a story of shame and then their punchline is, but when you really understand what happened, you know it wasn't my fault. And I'm like, well, that's a narcissistic answer, right? It's like, I don't, if the bottom line of every story is, and it wasn't my fault, right? That means I can't handle shame. I couldn't deal with that. And we run into a lot of this, right? So it affects our marriages, it affects our parenting, it affects our leadership. And so it's the opportunity. I remember when we were writing Rare Leadership together, Jim told me a story about being at a church where a guy was trying to shame him into taking a leadership role in something that Jim was not going to take. And after, you know, he just, you know, heaped the shame on him. And afterwards he was like, you just refuse to be shamed, don't you? And I'm like, he goes, yeah, and all those things touch base. They make me feel a little bit of shame, but I'm not going to be controlled by it. I can't let myself be controlled by the shame. So that's a mark of maturity, is that people can't control me with shame if I'm really living with maturity. There's some of us, if anybody puts any shame on us at all, we immediately capitulate. Well, they're going to do whatever they want because we can't handle that feeling. And so there's a lot of, you know, you talk about trolls on YouTube and that sort of thing. What they're doing, they're dealing in shame, right? They're trying to heap shame on you to see if they can get you to change who you are and what you do. So shame is a big issue, right? And that's why, and I think that for a lot of us, we didn't get much modeling on healthy ways of handling shame growing up. But it is at the heart of what we're talking about.
It is, and it has so many different ramifications as you just drew out for us. So let me make sure I get this straight. when we're talking about shame, it could be toxic shame or healthy shame. It's more of our ability to deal and handle it in a proper way.
That's not quite what I'm saying, but I see why you say that though. So
Okay.
what I'm
Correct me.
okay. So shame is something that I feel, think about it, right hemisphere, left hemisphere of the brain. Shame is something
Okay.
I feel in the right hemisphere of my brain.
Okay.
It becomes toxic or healthy depending on what happens to the left hemisphere. That is the narrative that goes with it. And so I can feel shame. And if the narrative is, therefore I'm a terrible person, that's toxic shame. If I feel shame and the narrative is, therefore I should probably change what I'm doing, that's healthy shame, right? So it's the narrative that goes with it that makes it toxic or healthy. And so so somebody can be heaping toxic shame on me, right? Because they're giving it a narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're telling me why I'm so horrible and why this is all my fault and all this other stuff. And a mature person, they're going to feel it, but then they will find a way to get back to joy from there. So they're not just stuck in shame. And they're also not going to do it in a way where they just deflect it immediately to other people because I can't handle it. So it's,
how do you deal with people trying to heap toxic shame on you? Like I call it the power of definition. Like if someone tells me, hey, this is terrible, what you've done, either I can decide whether or not I like that or not, or I agree with them or not, because they're trying to attempt to shame me into doing something that they want me to do.
Right.
So how do I respond there?
Well, I reminded me when I was a senior pastor, I got 2 notes on back-to-back days. And one of them said I was the most conceited pastor they had ever served under. The other said I was the most humble pastor they had ever met. So you, right, same week, one day apart from each other. And you look at this, and you're like, oh, so what do you do with this? And so what do I do with that note? It says, you're the most conceited pastor ever. And I'm like, okay, so I took this and I showed it to a couple of people I trust. And I said, is there anything to this? There's something I need to own here that I'm not seeing. And you gotta be careful because sometimes you just surrounded yourself with yes people, but what else can you do? You got to go find out, is there something I'm missing here? Do I owe this person an explanation? Because there was no explanation. There was no this event, this thing, this whatever, right? And you get a lot of those hit and run shame messages. And so you got to go say, if that's not the case, then God, I give this to you. And I need to get back to joy, which means, okay, I got to take a deep breath. I've got to get my brain out of just constantly focusing on what could I have done that made him think I was conceited. So that's all I'm thinking about all the time. I've got to find a way to distract myself out of that, let go of that, and replace those thoughts with some other thoughts so that it will help me to get back. And then I want to connect with people that I enjoy being with and get my brain in a relational space where it's easier to hold on to truth.
When we're talking about this issue, this rare leadership, or this idea of remaining relational and returning to joy and eye contact, and where do you find it working the most so far? In that, how have people live this out in their homes? But you even wrote a book on the workplace,
right,
about this very thing. Where do you see it taking place the most, in the workplace, or is the response that you're getting, is that from other people? I mean, in just everyday life.
Yeah. The number one response I'm getting is marriage. People, even when I teach leadership in workplaces, people are going like, this has changed my marriage, is the number one feedback I get, because they're learning how to stay relational with their husband or their wife in situations where they used to stop acting like themselves and become non-relational. The second is in the workplace. And I've had a few different business leaders now tell me about the transformation that has happened in their company when they began putting these principles into practice. One of them, a fairly large company, actually gives a rare leadership award every year, for the person who most models, mature leadership. They send out a text of the day to all their employees with the rare tip of the day, that sort of thing. There's a lot of, and they developed all this themselves just on the basis of running with the concepts that are there. So yeah, I've seen that's probably where I see it the most, is those two places. And then churches are hard nuts to crack, because all of us pastors were trained in seminaries that were basically anchored in that voluntarist approach to life. And it is not easy to overhaul your approach to living to become more attachment based before you get to all the performance stuff. And for most of us, our attachments have been based on our performance. Like, people like us because of our ability to solve problems, and our ability to lead, and our ability to be funny, and our ability to be insightful, and whatever it is. And so we get used to the idea that performance comes first and then come attachments. And so learning to flip that is a big move for a lot of us. And we're already so busy, it can feel like it's just not worth the effort, until we get, to a certain point in our ministry, realize that we've lost everything. Because I never really mastered the attachment part of all of this. And I think that's the number one thing that's killing leadership in all forms of our culture, is people have flipped those things for too long.
And they've placed it so much more on performance rather than the attachment of relationships.
Right. So one of my favorite stories in for leadership of the workplace comes from Margaret Heffernan, who talks about super chickens. And the idea here is
I'm looking it up because I remember writing about it in the book.
So I like it. First of all, just because super chickens is fun. But so there was a study done, I believe it was Purdue University, in which they were trying to breed super chickens who would produce more eggs. So they're measuring results. And all they're doing is measuring results. And that is, so every generation of chickens, they took out the top producers by most eggs per chicken and put them in a group. And they did this for 6 generations while they tried to breed super chickens who would be producing more eggs per chicken. So what they found when they got done with 6 generations of this was that the normal chickens, all right, the average chickens, were actually producing slightly more eggs per chicken at the end than when they started. They found in the super chicken group, only 3 of them were still alive. And what was happening was they were actually predator chickens. These chickens their results looked better than the other chickens, because they were pecking the other chickens and keeping their production down. And so by comparison, they were bullies. They were bully chickens. And so what happens, and so there's a clear leadership lesson here, right? And that is, if the only thing we measure is results, we are more likely to promote bullies and predators than maturity. And that's why you can't just say, how big did you grow this? How many sales did you get? How many, whatever. Because what happens is, if you only measure results, then you often end up collecting predators at the top of the food chain in whatever it is that you're trying to create. And the whole thing becomes toxic. So I think that's the number one reason why cultures become toxic, is that we are promoting, these bullies and predatory leaders, instead of the more mature leaders who keep relationships bigger than problems. It takes some discernment to separate those out, right? But if you've been in a setting that's run by mature people, they get results, but it's a completely different culture. And if you're in a place where it's all about results, and whatever we got to do with the culture to tinker with to get those results, that's what we're going to do. That's what creates toxicity.
How do you differentiate between an environment? You have a toxic environment, or one that is filled with toxicity. Between the performance aspect, where do you draw the line at a team member that's not working? Because it sounds like if we do it right, everybody's going to be happy and want to be here because we're remaining relational. We're going through all of these things. Yet there are always people that don't fit, or there seem to be some issue, and they're the toxic one, or maybe they just don't fit. And you have to let them know, as you remain relational, that you're fired. I mean, how do you do that?
Well, but that's kind of the take. There's a relational way to fire people and a non-relational way to fire people. And one of them is you tell people is like, what led up to the firing? Did you sit down with them and tell them what needed to change? Were you honest with them about how toxic they were being in the workplace? Did you give them steps on what needed to happen? Did you do some confronting up front, or did you just blow up one day and fire them? Right. There is a relational way to go about this. So a mature boss is going to say, hey, we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior here. And so I need to see this change. I need to see this change. I need to see this change. This is what I need from you. And so a lot of us get ourselves in trouble because we're so afraid of the confrontation that we end up dealing with a much bigger problem later on. And so again, who does the better job of confronting? It tends to be the more mature person, can do the confronting in a way that is relational, which is communicating, I care about you. I want to see you succeed. So here's the things that have to happen. And there's other cases where you say, you know what, the skill set we thought you were bringing to the table clearly isn't the skill set that you actually possess. So we're going to make a change and we're going to go in a different direction, but we wish you well. Here's references. Here's things you need. There's relational ways to do these things. And then there's non-relational ways to do them. So what we're talking about, in a sense, is more like firing people with maturity rather than that this keeps you from ever firing anybody.
You were a pastor for how long?
7 years.
So what now, knowing what you know now, what would you have gone back? What would you go back and do differently?
I would do more confrontation. I was a people pleaser who tried to make everybody happy. And I think that what I would do now is I would be a little more clear on what the performance things were that were needed, without losing the relational part of it. In other words, we were really good on the relational thing. I wasn't good at setting goals and things and getting results. I probably erred too much on the side of let's all be happy together, and not enough on here's our vision. This is what we need to see happen. And so what I found from the studies with Dr. Wilder and the rare leadership, research and all the things we're doing is that those don't have to be either or. Right. That's what I'm finding is that when you have enough emotional maturity, that's part of what characterizes it, is that you are dealing with hard things in a relational manner. Whereas immature people who are all about relationships just do the relationships and never deal with the hard stuff. Right. So if I can be an immature leader in a couple different directions, one is I can be immature because I avoid all the hard things going on. I just want everybody to be happy. That's not what we're talking about. I can also be an immature leader because I'm only pushing the hard stuff and I never take the time to give anybody a break or to have some joy or to enjoy what we're doing and build relational connection. And so you can err in both directions. And we've seen places fold and close for both reasons, right? So one is that somebody was so driven to results, they created toxicity. The other one is they were so afraid of toxicity, they wouldn't even talk about results. And you fail both directions because they're both signs of immaturity. So this is what we're looking at here is keep relationships bigger than problems, but deal with the problems.
What has been the reception that you've heard with people from this book?
It was kind of funny because I had a guy who was a bigwig with a huge company. And he said, firing people at our company is like flicking flies off of an airplane. He says, we've fired thousands of people a year. And he said, give me the metrics. What's going on with this? And he asked me about 26 questions because his first reaction was, I did not like the book because he thought it was, results is the only thing that matters kind of guy. And I answered his questions, gave the stuff back to him. He came back and he is now a volunteer for us, works and is helping us get the message out. He's become like a true believer on this because he sees now that if you build the culture, the results will come.
Did he get fired from his job for not performing?
No. He retired quite wealthy. Actually, he did very well in his job, and he's doing. He's done well with that. But what he began to notice in all of this was it was helping his marriage. It was helping him with his parenting. It was helping him with these other things. And he was seeing the connection that this is not either or, that you either are nice to people or you get results. Like this is talking about how do I not lose my humanity in all of this, right? How do I stay the relational engaged person that I want to be? And how do I create a culture of relational engaged people who are going after a mission, right? Who are going after this thing. And that's kind of the secret sauce, right? So you look at the best coaches, and there are coaches who win for a couple of years, but then they lose their voice in the locker room. And then there are people who create dynasties, you know, and they create cultures, and those cultures turn out success. And people love to tell their stories about being part of that culture and what it meant. So that's what we're talking about with a leader, is that priority one of leadership is the culture. Priority one is creating an identity that is anchored in joy. Like, it's the difference. One of the analogies that Jim used when we were first processing the book was, let's say you start off saying, I want to build a hamburger joint that sells we want to give people the best casual dining experience on the west side of Indianapolis, right? That's going to be our goal. Well, and then you don't make quite enough money the first month, so you cut corners, and you go from cloth napkins to paper napkins, and you cut some more corners. You cut, and before you know it, you're no longer anywhere near this identity of creating the best dining experience on the west side of Indy. So you've got to find a way of creating an identity that makes you want to go to work every day. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is why we're doing it. This is us, man. And it's like, I can't wait to go do this. I love the people I'm doing it with. I love the people we're going to. And the more hardships that we face and overcome as a team, the more bonded our team will become. So we don't bond by avoiding hard things. We bond by overcoming hard things together. And so that's really the hallmark of great leaders, right? Is that they are the ones who build teams that get stronger, right? The more battles that they have to face, versus immature leadership tends to create teams that fall apart in the face of hardship.
Have you had any other leadership people that teach leadership come to you after reading the book and say, what are you guys talking about here? This seems so different than anything that I've ever encountered.
Just a few. We have had a few. I mean, one of my favorite reviews on this was a guy with a PhD in leadership who said, it's practically my job to read books on leadership. And after a while, they all sound kind of the same. He says, this is the first one I've read that's truly different. And he said, in a long, long time. And he said, there's actually new paradigm, new thinking in this. And he said, in fact, the people who published the book said, most of our books have one novel idea that drive the book. You guys have a novel idea per chapter. And that's awesome. I attribute that to the genius of my co-author, Jim. My job is to make it understandable and simple and accessible. So that's the kind of feedback that we've gotten. We've gone into both churches and corporate places that have had a tradition of toxicity. And for a lot of people, they've just never even heard any of these paradigms before. And so what happens is, you may know it's toxic, but the question is, who do you blame for the toxicity? And what is to blame for the toxicity? And what you'll find is that everybody's so busy pointing the finger at other people that no one is actually looking at personal maturity and what the skills of personal maturity are, and what the culture should be, and how you grow that culture versus the one that we have grown. And so they aren't all success stories, right? But most of them have definitely had an aha moment where they go, I may have been thinking about this wrong. And that's kind of what we're after.
How do you define this maturity? You've already alluded to it. You've actually stated it, but I want to focus and zoom in on it for a moment so that people know what we're talking about when we talk about maturity. Maturity is simply what?
It's simply the ability to remain relational and act like myself when I face big emotions, right? So you can define it a bunch of different ways, but one thing that helps me is the concept of emotional capacity. And that is, how much emotional weight does it take before I lose my ability to be relational, I stop acting like myself, and I can't return to joy? How much emotional weight does it take? That is how I measure my maturity.
What do you mean then by being yourself? Act like yourself in the middle of all this.
So let's just say that I start to feel anxiety, and all of a sudden I say, we're scrapping all of our plans. We're going to change everything. We're going to do this now. This is what we're all about now. And then tomorrow I feel anxious about something else, and I change the whole thing again tomorrow. And it's like, and then I get hyper, and I get active, and I make bad decisions, and I just lead in a totally different style when I'm anxious and I'm afraid. I have turned into a different person because of my fear. That's what I mean. I don't act like myself, or I get angry, and all of a sudden you did something that made me mad, and I like blow up at you, and I went from being a kind, engaged, relational person to being completely non-relational, blowing up, acting like a 3-year-old, right? So when we don't act like ourselves, most of the time, what we're doing is we're reverting to a younger version of ourselves. So I can go from being a 50-something leader to acting like a 5-year-old who didn't make mama happy, right? And I'm having the exact same meltdown and emotional temper tantrum I would have had with my mom as a 5-year-old, but I'm 50. So what's happening is something got triggered. I'm not acting like myself right now. I'm acting like somebody else. And that's usually what ends up happening. So there's some consistency to this. And there's also just the developing that. So when I first discovered Jim's life model system, I was a senior pastor, and he had charts in there on infant, child, adult, parent, elder level maturity, and some of the core characteristics. So I simplify it this way. An infant can't do anything for themselves. So if an infant feels an upsetting emotion, you are going to have to soothe them. You can't look at the baby and say, just calm yourself down. You're going to be fine. I mean, in no capacity to do that. So the mark of their immaturity is zero capacity to handle any emotion without somebody else needing to come in and calm them down. Child level maturity, I am beginning to learn with your help. I can begin calming myself down with some help and guidance. And then by the time I'm an adult, I'm supposed to know how to feel these emotions and return to joy and handle more weight. So I expect a 17-year-old to be able to handle more than a 7-year-old to be able to handle more than a 7-month-old, right? And in the same way, that's because their maturity development is directly related to their ability to handle emotions and still be relational and act like themselves. So that's kind of what this is driving at. And when I first came across this and I looked at this, I'm like, okay, so infants have no capacity. Children have the ability to take care of one person. They can take care of themselves or they can take care of you, but I can't take care of both at the same time. I can either make sure I'm okay or I can make sure you're okay. And so if and when I looked at this whereas adults think about the group and that what is best for all of us? How do we create win-wins? What is best for me and my people to collectively? And that is, it's good for me and I have some to share with you. I can make sure that I'm okay while I'm taking care of you. So I looked at this and realized that as a senior pastor, I was functioning a lot of the time. I was functioning at child level maturity, trying to be an elder. And the gap in the emotional weight that an elder carries and the capacity of a child to carry was really big. And so I remember often wishing there was an older, more experienced veteran pastor I could lean on to help me carry some of the weight of all of the responsibility of this, because I realized that the emotional weight of leading a community is not meant to be carried by somebody in their 30s or 40s who are still raising their kids at home. It's meant to be carried by somebody who's done raising their kids, who's got this stuff. It doesn't mean that young people can't be pastors, but it means they need to be surrounded by these elders who have this gravitas to them that is not easily overwhelmed by the things going on in the church. That's what we're looking at here. So I became a senior pastor when I was 35. I don't think it was wrong for me to be. I had good visionary instincts. I was a good teacher. I understood how to run a church. But there are all the relational and emotional things that go into leading a church I was not up to, right? And so that's why there could be days when I would appear conceited and there would be days when I would appear humble, right? It's like you can be all over the place with all the various things that you're dealing with. So I'm looking at at all of this and I'm thinking what I needed was people to help me carry the weight. That is, people you can confide in and talk to. And, that's, I think what's a lot of is missing for our younger pastors.
The rare leadership aspect, that maturity to have people alongside them.
Yeah, the maturity that has other people alongside them, that they're not in this alone. And you think about the isolation that comes with leadership. It's like if we had a different model of leadership that says, as a leader, my core job is creating a culture, which means I need to be in relationship in a cultural relationship, I can't just be out here telling you how to create your culture. I have to actually be engaged in that culture and be a part of it. And that actually solves a lot of problems for me as well, because I do have other people handling some of the weight of what's going on, and it isn't just all on me. The churches, we talk about this a little bit. Churches have been too often too quick to embrace a kingmaker model of leadership, and that is, we hire a king and say, and then we will applaud you and praise you and pay you and give you all kinds of praise as long as you do this work for us and make everything okay. And so we look at the pastor, go, well, you're more educated than me, you're more talented than me, you're more anointed than me, you have a whatever. And he says, so you just do it, right? And there's a lot of us as pastors who we were raised like, okay, yeah, that's my job, I'll step in, I'll do that. And you're like, well, essentially we just made it a contract where I'll be your king. Right? Your job is and as long as I make you happy, there'll be no rebellion and no revolt, and I'll stay king. But and it's also why you get a lot of people in this situation where when problems come up, first thing they do is circle the wagons, find out who are their people, who's with me, who's against me, and things begin to split immediately over who's going to win. And that's a sign of immaturity as well.
It was funny. I heard the pastor of the church, we've relocated since we've started this ministry and started going to a church, and the pastor gets up and he starts talking about maturity, and he mentions the ability to endure hardship well. And I immediately recognized that. And I'd heard Jim Wilder say the same thing. And then he said, it was because I had this book given to me. Awesome. And he's a pastor of a larger church, and he listens to this show, and give a good shout out to him. But he said, because of this, that's how he was understanding it. And I think it's changed his understanding of it. Not only understanding leadership, though, I want to transition here for a moment and talk a bit about F.I.SH, is what, like you call heart-focused discipleship. What is F.I.SH? And you are, again, the acronym and the acrostic king.
Yeah, well, I have some competition there, but it is my default go-to. I will admit, we often joke I'm going to have a 365-day devotional calendar with an acrostic a day. But that's
good. I like that.
So F.I.SH is the and I'll be perfectly honest, I'm still not clear on the difference between an acrostic and an acronym. I've had people try to explain it to me, but I call them acrostic. So let's say this F.I.SH stands for freedom, identity, spirit, heart-focused community. It is meant to be four elements that come from the gospel, and understanding the gospel not just as here's your ticket to heaven, but the gospel as here's the foundation for a whole new life. Element number one of the gospel is we die with Christ. Right? Why do we die with Christ? We die to be set free from what enslaves us. Right? We die with Christ to die to the world, to die to the law, to die to sin. Why do we die to these things? Because they enslave us. And so we say freedom is the foundational pillar of the gospel, that we are all slaves of sin and Christ died to set us free. Paul even uses this imagery of being locked up in a prison, and God with one key, the cross, and Christ did at the cross, sets us all free with this one thing that Christ did. So now discipleship is, all right, if we have been set free, why? We need to learn how to live in freedom. So heart-focused discipleship says discipleship starts with, let us help people break. Now that they have been set free by the gospel, let's teach them how to live in freedom. How do I actually experience the freedom that is my birthright in Christ? And that gets us into spiritual warfare. It gets us into emotional healing. It gets us into repentance. It gets us into forgiveness, right? It gets us into lies we believe versus truth we believe. So there's a whole journey related to freedom that is fundamental to discipleship that we've tended to outsource to counseling. I'm like, this is crucial though. So the I of identity is a second element of the gospel, is that we're raised with Christ, right? Well, why are we raised with Christ? Well, we're raised to be seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. Well, that puts us in a position of intimacy with God and a position of authority as we interact with the spiritual realm. It changes our identity. And so this is where we go, that the second element of the gospel is I have a new identity in Christ because I have been raised with him and I am now united with him. So we'd have to learn, what does it look like to live in union with Christ, in greater union and greater intimacy with him? And this also connects to maturity, because if maturity is acting like myself, then the more mature I am as a Christian, the more consistently I should live with my identity in Christ, right? It should take more emotional weight to get me to stop acting like a Christian.
Mm.
And so this is all that's connected. Then we come to the next one, and that is this idea. So we die with Christ, we're raised with Christ, and then we're born again. So what does it mean to be born again? To be born again is to be born of the Spirit. So I am born of the Spirit. Why? So I can learn to live my life in the Spirit. Well, to me, that's Scripture, and that's relationship. That is, Holy Spirit's the author of Scripture. So I need to have a scriptural worldview. I need to be anchored in my scriptural understanding of reality. And I also need to learn how to be relational in my walk with God, that walking in the Spirit is about a relationship. Now, that relationship may end in expressions of power, but it's not fundamentally about the power, right? It's fundamentally about the relationship. And so walking in the Spirit is the third thing that is core to discipleship. And then it's heart-focused community, which takes us directly to, again, to that other half of church concept, that the soil in our relational soil in which I am making disciples is enormously important to the success ratio I'm going to have at doing the first three things.
Mm.
So if I'm working on my freedom journey, but I'm in isolation, I'm just trying to get it out on my own, and I'm not in a group that's on a similar journey, that's going to be way harder than if I'm in a group that's on this journey together. Same thing with identity. I need to have people around me who remind me who I am and how it's like me to act, and to call it out of me and say, I see this in you. I see this quality in you. I'm going to call that out, right? I need people in my life to help me stay who I am and grow my maturity. Same thing with walking in the Spirit. If I just isolate myself in a hole and decide I'm going to teach myself to hear God's voice, I've got no corrections on that, right? I've got nobody talking into this saying, I don't think that's God's voice, right? We need community to learn how to walk in the Spirit. And you look at when Paul wrote, almost everything he wrote is we and us and to you, plural. He's almost never telling an individual, this is what you specifically need to do, because he's thinking in terms of group identity and really wanting churches to form the kind of group identity that is routinely producing mature Christians who present people mature before Christ. So I'm like, how do we do this? And so the dream is that you can walk into any church in America and get help with all these four things. Like there's going to be community that's a thriving community that you can connect with. There's going to be people on there's going to be freedom ministries taking place and people on freedom journeys. And when you say I'm working on my heart issues and I'm working with my addictions and I'm working with my emotional things that I don't handle well and whatever, that they're like, yeah, that's what we're doing too. Come on, let's go. And that you could walk into any church and you're going to get all of this. That's the goal. And right now, the problem I ran into for most of my ministries, people will come to me with problems. I'd look around through my mind, I do a checklist. I couldn't think of a church that did most of them. It's like, I couldn't say, go to the church, they'll be able to help you with your freedom problems. I couldn't, I can't tell you how many times I was sitting here going, yeah, I have no idea where to send you. And so I say this because these things are essential to my own growth journey, that when I struggle, when I'm stuck and I'm not going, it's usually because something here is not in place. I'm missing one of these. And because as a pastor, when I saw people really transform and really grow, these are the elements that were present. And, and also just in pastoral counseling and transformational ministries, you begin to look at what I asked a group of pastors this question. If the Apostle Paul was going to say, here are the three keys to a victorious Christian life, what would they be? Or what would the four be? And we just went through Romans 5-8 and go, doesn't that lead us to dying with Christ, raised with Christ, and walking in the Spirit and doing it in community? I mean, aren't those the four things? I said, so why isn't every seminary and college, Christian college, teaching all of our pastors to be experts in all these four things? And I'm like, we aren't taught that way. And, you and I both went to seminary. We know what it's like. And there's a ton of people who go through seminary. It's the driest, deadest time of their Christian growth. Now there's others, it's the opposite. It's wonderful, but it's usually because they made a lot of friends there and there's a lot of joy. But there's some of us, the time that you would think would be the apex of your Christian growth is actually not. I know me personally, I went through a most significant depression of my life when I was in seminary. So we're like, there's something broken here is the idea. There's a broken discipleship factory that needs to get fixed. And the F.I.SH model is an attempt to lay out, well, here's some essentials that we need to do. And then it ends with the idea that when we focus on these four things, it will create mission. Right. And it will create healthier mission. say my father was the director of the School of World Missions and Evangelism at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School back in the 80s. And, he dealt a lot of counseling with a lot of missionaries who went into mission, but they weren't free. They didn't know their identity. They weren't walking in the Spirit, and they had no community. And you're like, well, that's a recipe for failure in mission. On the other hand, if I am growing in freedom, I'm living out of identity, I'm in community, I want to invite people into that. I want to help other people who are struggling with these things find what I have been discovering and get on that same journey. So that's the there you go. My mini sermon on fish.
It's funny though, you mentioned seminary, because you don't get that very often. I mean, I went to Bible college and I went to 2 seminaries, and I got it more in Bible college than I did in the seminaries that I was in, and different circumstances of life, different series of things. But you're right. It can become pretty depressing in an academic environment like that. And not that the professors want that to happen. I mean, any of us would say that they don't. Many of my good friends are professors, and they would say that. And I know some schools have taken the steps necessary to counteract that. But it made me, while I was there, to start looking at seminary a bit like chemotherapy. It kills off a lot of who you are. Hopefully it kills the bad, but it can also kill some of the good. And the question is are you going to survive when you get through there? Because it should help you in your walk with Jesus and help you find that aspect of it. Now, I am curious about something, and I'm curious if you can answer this question or not. You're talking about heart-shaped community, or heart-focused community. To me, the culture of belonging in our communities right now is very hard. A variety of reasons. Some, if they're in a larger church, you have to find those spheres, as you mentioned, getting plugged into those spheres. 2 questions that I have. Number one, when is it time, if a church isn't willing to do that or is doing that? They might have everything else orthodox. And do you leave if they don't have that heart-shaped community you've tried? Heart-focused community. Do you need to go find it someplace else? Or what if another church has that, but they're not walking within your doctrinal comfortability, but they have the community, whereas the other church has the orthodoxy, but not the community? What do you do?
Yeah, that is a challenge, isn't it? I've experienced both. I've been in the best community group I was ever in, had the worst theology of any church I had been in. And I did end up leaving, because you just can't stay in that for forever. I do think that leaving is an option that is on the table in a way that it wasn't when we were all in parish systems. So what I tell people is you kind of got to build your team and your people partly in your church and partly independently of your church. So the idea here is that I may be called to do ministry in a church and God wants me there, but it isn't necessarily where I get my soul fed. That can happen, right? Where I'm called to be a part of this. But if that is the case, then I need to have other people in my life that I'm connecting to. So the nice thing about the Zoom culture that we're in, right? We can, you can kind of collect people that you can talk to, because what we're talking about is level of transparency, right? How transparent can I be and know that I will still be met with empathy and with happy to be with you, right? If I'm too transparent, will you no longer be happy to see me? So that's the question. Now, in any church, you don't just lead with that. You don't get up on stage, pull up the mic and tell everybody your darkest secrets, because not everybody has the maturity to handle that. So, but within the Christian community, you've got to find the people who've got the emotional maturity to hear your story and still be happy to be with you. It's actually why boundaries are so important. One of the ideas behind boundaries in relationship is you need to know that when we're together, I'm going to be happy to see you. And so if we've set up time and we're going to have, this kind of time together, then I have devoted that here and I'm going to be happy to be with you while we're together. But if I'm going to the bathroom, you show up and you want to talk about your problems, I may not be happy to see you. There's You start with the extreme, right? There's obvious boundaries here where I don't want you here, right? I don't want you in my bedroom at night. I don't want you here at night. I don't want you there. And you just start expanding that out. And you're like, well, what am I saying here is I want to make sure that I'm happy to be with you when we're together. And that's why boundaries matter. So it's actually for both of us so that you know what you can count on. And I remember as a young person, I didn't know what to call it, but I remember kind of the mirror neurons in my brain were watching this guy, and he was a good friend of mine. And I walked into the room and he paid zero attention to me. And at first I was upset, but then I realized he was completely focused on the person he was with. They had his undivided attention. And I then actually respected him because I realized, you know what, when I'm that person, I'm going to get his undivided attention. And I thought there was something, comforting about that. Now, if he had seen me, he would have waved and come back to it, but there's a way to be there. But that's kind of the idea. And that's why when we talk about heart-focused community, what we're really talking about is a community that is dealing with freedom issues, dealing with identity issues, helping people grow their maturity, helping people walk in the Spirit. It's not all just Bible, right? So I don't want to minimize Bible, but we have sometimes been minimalistic with it. And so that's what we're trying to say is heart focused is saying there's more going on at our church than education. We deal with the issues that are actually going on in your heart.
Well, you mentioned that, and I've used your ABCs, the academic training, the behavior modification, and church activities as our means of discipleship. And that leads me actually to a third question, because I'm going to skip over the second one that you've already really alluded to, but I'm going to come back to. And if a church is all about the Sunday morning experience, what then is the mechanism that you put in place, if there is one, to help create this culture? And you've, again, alluded to it from the relational standpoint, starts with the pastors, leads it down, kind of the trickle down effect. But what other things can you put into place in order to bring out this heart-shaped community so it's not a attractional, we go to class, formal instruction, so that it's the organic, real, I want to be with you, joy activity that we want it to be?
Yeah. Well, it's an excellent question because it is a bit intangible, right? Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, most of the organic things that develop are building around something programmed. Mm-hmm. So when you went to high school, it was a very programmed thing, but you made friends there that you wanted to hang out with afterwards. So even though you've been with them all day, you still wanted to hang out with them that night. What's going on there? Well, that's because you have a joy bond with those people. You have joy and energy when you're around them. So churches can't mandate that, right? You can't program that, but you can put programs together that give people the opportunity to connect. And then you have to begin infusing your cultures with values. And some of those values you model, some of them you teach, some of it, but you're using teaching and instruction and modeling and practice to start getting certain skills into these places to make it more likely. So this is why you can have two churches that have exactly the same programming, and one will flourish relationally and the other won't. And it really comes down to the maturity of the people who are not just the maturity of the person who organized the structure, but the maturity of the people who are actively running it. So that's why you can go to one small group and it's just blah. And you can go to another small group and it's life-changing. And it usually has to do with, again, that maturity and capacity of those who are leading. And so that trickles down. So like in youth groups, it's often the youth themselves and the level of maturity they're bringing to the leadership that they bring into this that makes a big difference. And so I often use youth as an example because I've talked to so many pastors, like, how do we not lose our young people? And they come up with the same two answers, and that is better apologetics and a more cool experience, right? And I'm like, well, what if the actual answer there is attachment? What if the reason we're losing our young people is they feel no attachment to the people in the church? And so the only people they know are the other teenagers, and they don't know anybody else in the church. So why would they come back?
Are you familiar with Christian Smith's work?
No, for now.
So Christian Smith, the researcher out of Notre Dame, he wrote some books years ago, and it was based on the study of religion in American youth. And that's not how they Souls in Transition was there was a work before that. The second volume was Souls in Transition. He wrote another one, but in the book, he talks about they were doing a study on youth, American youth and religion, but they didn't let the people in the study know that was about, and it was over a period of time. Basically, it came down to how are there factors that we can isolate for people who grew up in the church and stayed in it? And he said it came down to three things that they saw. Number one was that the family did what they practiced, or what the parents did what they said, and they practiced what they preached. Number two, they suffered in some capacity for their faith. But thirdly, and I thought this was an interesting one, it was another adult outside of the family reiterated what the parents said. But that's that attachment issue. There's some type of relationship with a person who's an adult. This kind of flies in the face of a lot of the modern youth ministry. And like you, I hear all the time, apologetics. And again, apologetics has its place. Worldview has its place. We're not saying that those don't have its place, but like with anything, it's not the solution to everything. It's a good thing can become the primary thing, then it becomes a bad thing. So we're saying, or what I'm hearing you say, and I do agree with you, is that the relational aspect informs a lot of those other pieces that we don't realize. I mean, we do need to have a reason to give a reason for the hope that we have in Christ Jesus. At the same time, it's the relational components that we are losing that the church has not paid very much attention to. And when people are leaving the church, oftentimes it's not because of apologetics. They know the answers. This is why I think people are deconstructing right now, is that they have the answers, but they don't have the relational identity, and that some of them are rebelling against what they see has been taught to them. And it wasn't within the context of relationship, or it was not helpful. It was only to keep them in subjection, if you will, and not actually for their benefit or their joy to understand in a greater way who God is. I mean, what do you think about that? Am I way off there, or am I a genius?
Well,
wait, what was that conceited thing?
I said, being the people pleaser that I am, you're a genius. Now, all right.
Right. Now my wife's like, oh, you have no idea what you've just done.
No, it's funny.
His head has become a float at the Macy's Day Parade. Not a genius at all. Well, but anyway, go ahead.
But you're spot on though, in terms of, it's like my son went to a private Christian school for the last couple of years. It was one of the biggest ones in the Midwest. And he told me that most of his friends are not Christians who attend there. Mm-hmm. Right. And he said that most of them can't wait to leave home and to never go back to anything Christian. Mm-hmm. So why? Right? Why is that the case? Because they're in Bible classes, right? They're getting theology, and they're getting apologetics, and they're getting they have spiritual emphasis week, right? They've got preachers coming in. They have mandatory chapel where they got preachers coming in and tell them stuff. So what's going on here? For the number one answer was family. There is an inconsistency between what the family is trying to get the school to Christianize their kid, but they're not really doing it at home.
Yep.
Secondly, my big thing is at the family level is that the goal of parenting was get your kids to perform and succeed. And so now we're beginning to then the pendulum kind of swung the other way, and that is just love your kids and don't worry if they succeed. And what we're looking at here, what I used to tell my kids is, because I love you, I want you to succeed. And that's why we're going to have to do, correcting when there's correcting. But what I found is that there is a joyful foundation between parent and child. The correction is easier, and they are way more open to what you have to offer. But if I have a fear foundation in my relationship with my kids, right, then I'm using more fear to try to get them to be Christian. And there is no joy pull to Christianity. And it's not just families. That happens in churches. It happens in the schools. It happens in all these other places. So people can be saturated with Christian environments, but all those Christian environments are kind of anchored in the fear of you better. instead of actually really developing the kind of joyful attachment makes them want to be a part of this.
Mm. That's the challenge, though, isn't it? I mean, what about what about the people that are not in a leadership position? I mean, I've been in leadership positions. It's easier when you're in a leadership position. Mm-hmm. Most people, though, don't think about this. I mean, and you and I both know this. Sometimes it feels like we're trying to push that rock up this hill, and helping people to see the power of it. The reality of this is where actually they live.
Yeah, and that's why more largely what we're talking about here is that I need to be a personally mature person in whatever I'm dealing with. Mm. Right. So if I'm a personally mature person with my family, it's going to help the family. If I'm a personally mature person in the workplace, it's going to help the workplace. I may have no ability to influence the structures or the overall culture of the place, but simply by being a joyful, mature person, I have an impact. So I can control what I can control. It's not my job to transform a toxic culture. It's not my job to do that unless that's what I've been called in to do. And so now as a leader, I'm going, okay, if I am like in charge, then I'm looking at what am I in charge of and to what extent can I infuse this kind of relational community into this culture. So maybe I'm the football coach, but I can't run the whole school, but I have some control over this team. Or maybe I am I'm a parent. I got some control of my family, even though I don't have control over the church. So you're looking at where do I have influence? What can I affect? And how do I breed a culture of, joy and handling emotions together for them? So there's a lot. People are like, well, how do you do this? How do you do this? And that's, there's a lot of training that goes into this, because what's supposed to happen is that we're all supposed to naturally develop this just because of all the mature people that we're raised by. Right. So maturity development is supposed to happen because as an infant, I've got my older brothers and sisters, or I've got aunts and uncles, and I got grandparents, and I got my parents, and I've got the friends of the family. And all of these people can handle emotions, and they're all there helping me. And so what you find is that people who are naturally joyful and naturally resilient often don't know how they got there. And it's because they just kind of grew up with it, with all of these relational connections and all this. And what happens with those relational connections is this kind of confidence that I'm never going to have to go through anything alone. My people will go through this with me. So whereas if I'm in a completely broken environment and I have to learn to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, and I never know who's going to be with me when I go through things, it's much harder to have emotional resilience and emotional stability because I didn't grow up with it. And so now what Dr. Wilder and Chris Corsi and myself and people like that are trying to do is break this down. If I did not grow up with it, I don't have this. This is foreign. Where do I start? How do I begin building this? So I actually have a book coming out with Chris Corsi next year called The 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People, right? It's designed to do exactly that. Where do I start? But we kind of do that in Rare Leadership of the Workplace too. There are what we call 8 maturity workouts in this book. So the idea is that if you do these workouts with a small group of people and everybody's doing them and you do this together, it puts you in position to begin growing some of the skills and habits that lead to greater emotional maturity.
And I want to do those. I mean, if you would have asked me before the show, even before I encountered a lot of what you're doing, are you mature? And I'd say, of course. And I've been in the faith. I've gone to seminary. I know all the answers to different things. I would say that there's a piece that's missing. I remember working with a senior pastor one time, and I saw him, and he seemed like a really mature person until you got him onto any athletic contest. And then the reality of who he was really came out. I mean, he became very childish, and it was embarrassing. Actually, it was embarrassing for people of the church. It was embarrassing for other people. But there's times where I've had that in my own life. And it's made me stop and go, why do I act that way? Why is it that I remove myself from this situation and I can feel my voice quivering and my pitch rising right now? What is that? And how do I help other people see that? Because that doesn't always fit within the seminary trained answers of the, Paul and where the law fits and all those different things. It's not what we teach in our discipleship stuff. We give information. We give more and more information. We'll talk about what we should do, but we don't always put the practices in place to help facilitate that. We think that it's a byproduct. And we're saying here, no, these are the attentional leadership skills and relational maturity skills is what they really are. right? Would you say
Right.
that? I mean,
Yes, absolutely. These are relational
it,
maturity skills.
these are relational maturity skills. And today, with the fragmentation of the family, the crush of modernity telling us to perform, and something that's been caught up in since the Enlightenment, really, and part and parcel of the Protestant work ethic in which we've been installed with. It's go, 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 do, produce, 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 produce. And if you're not, you just get, you fall to the wayside. You weren't strong enough.
Exactly. Well, I used to feel like my life was a teeter-totter that went between performance and pleasure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like perform, 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 reload with pleasure. Okay, go perform, 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 reload with pleasure. But the whole model was just me. It's what we understand. I love one of the pictures that Jim pointed out. He calls it Joy Mountain and Joy Camp. And the idea is that if you go camping, first thing you do is you set up your camp, you make sure everybody's going to be okay. And then you kind of set the guidelines. Okay, kids, you got to stay with your parents. You older kids, you can go as far as the lake, but don't go past that. Then you adults just be back by 8 kind of thing. Right. And so what happens then is at the end of the day, whether you have had a good day or a bad day, you're going to be with your people back in Joy Camp, sharing the stories of the day. Sharing what went wrong, sharing what went right, sharing the good things, sharing the bad things. And you can end that day in joy, even if you had a bad day, because you get to share all of that with your people. And so now your day ends in quiet. After the joy, it's now easy to find peace. You rest, you wake up in the morning, and guess what? You're with your people, you connect, you start, then you go out and you climb Joy Mountain. You might have a good day, you might have a bad day, but at the end of the day, you come and there's this rhythm to life. He says, so what really messed that up is it gets to be 8:30 and there's somebody not there, right? You said everybody back by 8. Now it's 8:30 and 2 of the adults aren't there. Now it's 9 and they're not there. What happens? Joy leaves Joy Camp. You go find your people. You want to make sure everybody is back because there's an attachment. They are my people. That's part of our group. We got to make sure that our people are okay. So part of the power of group joy in the discipleship process is it means that I've got people who notice when I am slipping away. They notice when I am not at the camp. They notice when things aren't right, and they go get me simply because I'm part of the group. I'm one of them. So without that group identity, without that group culture, without that rhythm, relational rhythm, it's easy to get lost. And so when we all have weekdays, we all have our bad times, and when we slip into them, if we don't have anybody who notices, right, what's going to happen to us? And so that's part of the power of this, and why it is so important. Is it just cultivates that rhythm that facilitates growth.
And that is something that I think we all need. That rhythm that facilitates growth. Marcus, we have taken up a lot of your time. Thank you so much for being so generous and coming on the show and discussing these books. Once again, how can people follow along with what you're doing?
So they want to follow deeperwalkinternational.org is our ministry website, deeperwalkinternational.org. And then our more secular facing website for corporate things is rareleadership.net.
And we'll look those up. We'll put those on the show notes so everybody can get access to those. But Marcus, again, thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
It's been a lot of fun, Travis, as usual. I've really enjoyed getting to know you.